Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Last year in April 2019, I made a video called What is Millennial Fiction, where I talked about The New Me by Halle Butler, Severance by Ling Ma, Chemistry by Weike Wong, and for some cross-generational and cross-cultural comparison, My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh, Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, and Pavan for a Dead Princess by Park Min-gyu. And I've read some books recently that made me want to make a follow-up or a part 2 to that discussion. Those books are Luster by Raven Leilani, which came out just last Tuesday and seems to be one of the buzziest debuts in recent memory. Exciting Times by Naoise Dolan, another buzzy debut that came out earlier this summer, and Lot by Bryan Washington, which came out in March of 2019. All of these books were written by authors born between the years 1990 and 1993, and all of them got me thinking again about what qualifies as millennial fiction, particularly in light of the second wave of Sally Rooney discourse that accompanied the television adaptation of Normal People this past spring, and in light of the ways that Sally Rooney's books seem to have become the control group against which critics evaluate and discuss other millennial fiction. Just as a quick recap, in that first What is Millennial Fiction video, I looked at how The New Me by Halle Butler fit into what literary critics seemed to have identified as the parameters of millennial fiction. Those parameters often included repulsively realistic heroines, 20-somethings having a hard time adulting, urban disaffection and existential ennui, a pressure to self-actualize through work and professional accomplishments even in the face of stagnating wages and downward economic mobility, and a pervading sense of what Anne Helen Petersen has termed millennial burnout. And in that video, I tried to argue that the defining characteristics of millennial fiction in fact describe a fairly narrow and specific subset of the millennial population, namely 20-something urban-dwelling millennials with four-year college degrees, many of them white and female, and most of them with some kind of financial safety net to fall back on. And so I find the term millennial fiction, at least as it's been deployed in literary discourse, limiting at best and aggravating at worst, because A, it tends to essentialize an entire generation through the lens of a very particular kind of millennial narrative, and B, because it bestows on certain books a perceived weight of universality or generational import, while other books that speak to different but equally specific kinds of 21st century experiences are not singled out as culturally significant in a broad sense. Which brings me to Sally Rooney, because although I don't love the term millennial fiction, it has become an undeniably powerful buzzword that seems to have its origins in the work of Sally Rooney, or at least in the critical reaction to the work of Sally Rooney. In a profile from August 31st, 2018, the New York Times called Sally Rooney the first great millennial author, and said that her books Conversations with Friends and Normal People marked, quote, the arrival of millennial fiction. And in the 2 years since that piece, critics have unfailingly leaned into that narrative of Sally Rooney's novels as the texts of millennial fiction. And although I didn't touch on Sally Rooney's work directly in that first What is Millennial Fiction video, in my review of Normal People from September 2018, I did note that the crowning of Sally Rooney as the voice of her generation felt premature, and I believe I said critics maybe need to go out and meet some other kinds of millennials. And so that's my very long-winded way of saying that today I'm here to talk about some books written by other kinds of millennials, namely Luster, Exciting Times, and Lot. And in addition to highly recommending all of these books, I also wanted to take a look at the ways that they've been discussed in the media and where they align with and diverge from the Sally Rooney model of millennial fiction. And I wanted to start with Luster by Raven Leilani, which was really the catalyst for this whole video. This novel follows Edie, a 23-year-old Black woman trying to get by in New York City on an underpaid publishing salary, and who fills the emotional void with lots of non-committal little sex, and too much of it with a grab bag of various male co-workers. After she is fired for sexual impropriety, Edie finds herself more adrift than ever, and that driftlessness washes her all the way out to the Jersey suburbs, to the home of Eric, an older white man who she's been having an affair with. And it's there that she takes up a weird kind of refuge with Eric's wife Rebecca and his adopted daughter Akila, both of whom are kind of freakishly tolerant of the whole situation. As I mentioned earlier, this book came out just last week, but I read an early copy of it back in June, and it has one of the strongest opening 30 to 40 pages that I've read in years. The writing was just so fresh, and the voice of Edie, the narrator, was so bracing and witheringly perceptive that one of the first thoughts I had was, is Raven Leilani going to be met with the same kind of hype and breathless praise that Sally Rooney was greeted with a couple of years ago? And I think that my June self would be pleasantly surprised to learn that the answer thus far appears to be yes. I've been tracking the critical conversation around Luster for the past few weeks, and prior to publication, only a couple of early reviews mentioned the word millennial or made any type of nod to Sally Rooney or generational universality. USA Today said that Luster has the, quote, I can't even tone that has become something of an institutional voice for millennial writers, and the AV Club interestingly identified Edie as a, quote, typical Gen Z character. Other outlets described Edie as a messy 20-something without necessarily placing her in the context of other millennial fiction about other messy 20-somethings. But upon publication, the conversation started to shift in that direction. The Atlantic said in their review that, quote, Leilani's caustic prose is on brand for millennial literature of the past few years. Entertainment Weekly ran a profile of Leilani that said that Luster, quote, grapples with the messy millennial and the American dream, and BuzzFeed ran a profile of Leilani where they called Luster the next great millennial novel, comparing it to the work of Sally Rooney with the headline, if you like normal people, you'll love Luster. Noting that while it, quote, has all the hallmarks of a sacred millennial text, it also defies easy categorization. And I actually think that in terms of the prickly tone and the acid observational narration and the kind of sly, unsettling, dark humor that runs through the whole book, Luster actually has a lot more in common with books like The New Me or Severance or My Year of Rest and Relaxation than Sally Rooney's novels. Where Rooney's writing has a kind of exhilarating discipline and precision, Edie's inner monologue is much more unwieldy and constantly punctuated by these wholly original insights and entirely unexpected turns of phrase. At one point, Edie's looking at Rebecca and she thinks, quote, she is, I suppose, sexy in the way a triangle can be sexy. The clean pivot from point A to B to C, her body and face breaking no rules. And she later describes the marriage between Rebecca and Eric in this way. They do seem like different species. Rebecca, a lonely carnivorous bird, Eric, a vegetarian mammal with a short, panicked life. That surprising quality of Edie's narration keeps you on your toes the whole time and gives you this sense of the ground constantly shifting underneath your feet, an unsteadiness that also echoes the very real precarity of Edie's situation. Unlike some of the disaffected narrators of other millennial fiction, whose angst at times seems more theoretical than tangible, you get the sense that Edie may very well be on the verge of slipping through the cracks, or as she calls it, quote, the city's bounty of open holes. She doesn't have parents she can fall back on for emotional support or subsidized rent. The fact of her existence as a Black woman in the world means that she has to contend with the threat of two different kinds of violence that kind of hover around her head at all times. And her inability, like many 20-somethings, to get it together, to pay her bills, to take care of her mental health, the stakes of all of that millennial floundering feel much more fraught and urgent for Edie. And it's also worth noting that Edie's driftlessness is not quite the same kind of aimlessness that defines a lot of other millennial heroines. She's having trouble keeping her head above water, yes, but she's also this burgeoning artist driven by an undeniable impulse to create. She's not in search of a passion or purpose so much as she's trying to find a way to foster and direct it, and to kind of find her voice within the relentlessly punishing day-to-day struggle of trying to survive in a late capitalist society. I will say I found Edie as a narrator much more interesting than the plot that Raven Leilani dropped her into. I wish she hadn't spent so much of the book stuck at Eric and Rebecca's house, but the writing and the narration throughout were so strong and so indelible that I absolutely recommend Luster, and I'm very excited to see where Raven Leilani goes from here. Then I wanted to talk about Exciting Times by Naoise Dolan, which I read alongside Luster back in June, and which has been described as millennial and or compared to Sally Rooney in literally every review that turns up in a Google search. And to be fair, that probably has something to do with the fact that Naoise Dolan is another 20-something Irish writer whose characters and subject matter, namely love, sex, and the complicated interpersonal dynamics between highly educated but vaguely repressed millennials, are at first blush quite reminiscent of Sally Rooney. This novel follows Ava, a 22-year-old middle-class Irish woman who is living in Hong Kong and working as a TEFL teacher a few years after the 2014 Umbrella Movement protests. And while Ava and her fellow expats make various rhetorical allusions to the ongoing political situation in Hong Kong, Ava's personal concerns about politics, class, gender, colonial, and otherwise, are primarily examined through her non-relationship with an Eton-educated English banker named Julian, who she's having a lot of sex with, but who expresses less than zero interest in being her boyfriend. And where Sally Rooney's books look at social performativity and how power, class, and desire play out in the intimate space between individuals, with a focus that makes her books feel very insular and, in my opinion, not actually rooted in any particular place or time, Exciting Times in comparison does feel a bit more outward-looking and global. And although Ava, like many 20-somethings, often interprets the world around her through her own narrow and often narcissistic perspective, the book does at least try to position her in a broader kind of context. Ava ends up essentially living in Julian's luxury high-rise apartment rent-free, which places her at a literal physical remove from everyday Hong Kong life. She primarily hangs out with other expats, and she uses the Hong Kong backdrop and her job teaching English primarily as a way to deepen her own understanding of her Irish identity, particularly as it relates to the British Empire. And Ava's fixation on the cultural and linguistic differences between her and Julian at times felt like it bordered on a narcissism of small differences, and her tendency to align post-colonial Irish experience with post-colonial Hong Kong experience, all while glossing over issues of race and globalization and Eurocentrism, at times gave me pause, but I do think it reflects in a really interesting and often accurate way the millennial interest in and fixation on questions of identity. And Ava is at least self-aware enough to describe herself at one point as a pointless white person, and to describe her job teaching British English to wealthy Hong Kong kids as a neo-colonial enterprise. And in one of the many hypothetical conversations with Julian that she constructs in her own head, Ava imagines him telling her, quote, "Your interest in colonialism is at times morally serious and at times something you draw on when you're bored of hating me for being rich and male, and you can't hate me for being white because you're white too." So Dolan explores these questions of identity while also acknowledging the shallow and at times self-interested ways that her characters engage with them. And those questions are deepened and complicated to some extent when Ava meets and starts to fall in love with Edith, another wealthy Oxbridge-educated banker who is also a native Hong Konger and a queer woman. And while the highly observational and kind of bantering quality of Dolan's writing does initially put you in mind of something like Conversations with Friends or Normal People, Sally Rooney's writing is often so direct and clinical and scalpel sharp, whereas Ava's narration is this very endearing and often quite vulnerable mix of kind of quick flippancy and often devastating earnestness, and this constant self-deprecation and self-correction that I think often echoes the way that millennials exist in online spaces, in that constant feedback loop of information. And to that end, the way that Dolan writes about social media and Instagram and texting is so spot on and pitch perfect and just a delight to read. So yeah, there's a lot to love with Exciting Times. I do think that it is very much a novel about dumb 20-something millennials, but I also think that the instant and easy Sally Rooney comparison is a little reductive and is kind of a disservice to both of those authors. And lastly, I wanted to talk about Lot by Bryan Washington, which is a collection of interconnected short stories set in Houston's working class immigrant neighborhoods in the years leading up to Hurricane Harvey in 2017. This book received a lot of glowing reviews when it came out in 2019, and rightly so, and most of them talked about Lot as a book about Houston and a book about race and queerness and sexuality and people living on the margins. The Financial Times was the only outlet that I could find that explicitly called Lot a work of millennial fiction, and they said, quote, "Bryan Washington reads like a millennial Lucia Berlin." And in some ways, I do understand why this book isn't discussed or classified as millennial fiction, since a lot of the stories here do focus on community and a number of different characters of various ages. And there isn't really a central 20-something protagonist who meets the criteria of the typical millennial hero or heroine. That being said, just about every other story in this collection does follow a young Afro-Latinx kid named Nick, who is coming of age and coming to terms with his sexuality in Houston's East End neighborhood. And his story provides a really powerful, emotional, and narrative through line for the book, and it explores things like poverty and immigration in the United States, navigating spaces as a biracial and bilingual person, grappling with your sexuality in an environment where it still doesn't feel particularly safe to do so, and the impact of things like gentrification and hurricanes and climate change on American cities and their poorer communities. And unlike characters like Edie or Ava, Nick isn't so much concerned with trying to make it in a particular city, so much as he's trying to find out where he belongs in and can survive in a city that is actively trying to push him out. And perhaps those qualify as stories about characters at the margin, but at this point in America, the margins have gotten pretty freaking big, and Nick's story feels as vital and as millennial and as of the moment as Luster or Exciting Times or Normal People. Nick is just instead representative of a different but equally specific kind of millennial experience. And it's just a stunning and profoundly moving collection. And in the stories that don't focus specifically on Nick, Bryan Washington is able to evoke the sounds and the energy and the rhythms of particular Houston neighborhoods and a sense of communal storytelling that actually at times reminded me of Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan novels. And yeah, I just really can't say enough good things about this book. It's phenomenal, and I highly recommend that you check it out, millennial or not. In closing, now that I have talked for what feels like 5 lifetimes, I wanted to leave you with this quote from Parul Segal's review of Luster in the New York Times. She says, "Novels by young writers tend to attract a strange sort of attention, more anthropological than literary. What does the work of Sally Rooney tell us about millennial precarity? What does Cat Person reveal about gender and power? It's not that fiction can't be a rich mine of evidence, but such analyses often go against how and why most people read. We don't go to novels because they are timely, but because they feel timeless in their treatment of consciousness and emotional life. We don't want characters to exist as a bundle of symptoms, but as full personalities in their rich confusion and ambivalence." And I sympathize with that perspective and would certainly like to see our discourse around contemporary fiction lean less heavily on reductive ideas of cultural relevance and anthropological buzzwords like millennial fiction that are shorthand for timely and urgent and must read. But at the same time, every book is to some extent a reflection of its particular historical moment and cultural context. And my reservations about certain terminology aside, I do think that that is worth examining and mining for all of its various meanings. But if we are going to talk about the cultural significance of contemporary fiction, I would like to see those umbrella terms like millennial fiction used in more expansive and dynamic ways. And I would also love to see a more thoughtful and creative approach to how we use comp titles when talking about books, an approach that maybe resists the obvious urge to draw a straight line between books like Exciting Times and Normal People, or Normal People and any book written by a millennial author. But anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts on any of the books or ideas mentioned here, and I solemnly swear that this is the last time that the word millennial fiction will ever be uttered on this channel, so get your thoughts out about it now. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.